the new god of metal, the new gods of metal, the new god of metal, the new goddess of metal, the new goddesses of metal, the new goddess of metal, the old god of metal, the old gods of metal, the old god of metal, the old goddess of metal, the old goddesses of metal, the old goddess of metal, the greater god of metal, the greater gods of metal, the greater god of metal, the greater goddess of metal, the greater goddesses of metal, the greater goddess of metal, the lesser god of metal, the lesser gods of metal, the lesser god of metal, the lesser goddess of metal, the lesser goddesses of metal, the lesser goddess of metal, the higher god of metal, the higher gods of metal, the higher god of metal, the higher goddess of metal, the higher goddesses of metal, the higher goddess of metal, the lower god of metal, the lower gods of metal, the lower god of metal, the lower goddess of metal, the lower goddesses of metal, the lower goddess of metal, the greater spirit of metal, the greater spirits of metal, the greater spirit of metal, the lesser spirit of metal, the lesser spirits of metal, the lesser spirit of metal, the higher spirit of metal, the higher spirits of metal, the higher spirit of metal, the lower spirit of metal, the lower spirits of metal, the lower spirit of metal, the major god of metal, the major gods of metal, the major god of metal, the major goddess of metal, the major goddesses of metal, the major goddess of metal, the minor god of metal, the minor gods of metal, the minor god of metal, the minor goddess of metal, the minor goddesses of metal, the minor goddess of metal, the superior god of metal, the superior gods of metal, the superior god of metal, the superior goddess of metal, the superior goddesses of metal, the superior goddess of metal, the inferior god of metal, the inferior gods of metal, the inferior god of metal, the inferior goddess of metal, the inferior goddesses of metal, the inferior goddess of metal, the ancestor god of metal, the ancestor gods of metal, the ancestor god of metal, the ancestor goddess of metal, the ancestor goddesses of metal, the ancestor goddess of metal, the ascendant god of metal, the ascendant gods of metal, the ascendant god of metal, the ascendant goddess of metal, the ascendant goddesses of metal, the ascendant goddess of metal, the descendant god of metal, the descendant gods of metal, the descendant god of metal, the descendant goddess of metal, the descendant goddesses of metal, the descendant goddess of metal, the transcendent god of metal, the transcendent gods of metal, the transcendent god of metal, the transcendent goddess of metal, the transcendent goddesses of metal, the transcendent goddess of metal, the past god of metal, the past gods of metal, the past god of metal, the past goddess of metal, the past goddesses of metal, the past goddess of metal, the present god of metal, the present gods of metal, the present god of metal, the present goddess of metal, the present goddesses of metal, the present goddess of metal, the future god of metal, the future gods of metal, the future god of metal, the future goddess of metal, the future goddesses of metal, the future goddess of metal, the authentic god of metal, the authentic gods of metal, the authentic god of metal, the authentic goddess of metal, the authentic goddesses of metal, the authentic goddess of metal, the synthetic god of metal, the synthetic gods of metal, the synthetic god of metal, the synthetic goddess of metal, the synthetic goddesses of metal, the synthetic goddess of metal, the progressive god of metal, the progressive gods of metal, the progressive god of metal, the progressive goddess of metal, the progressive goddesses of metal, the progressive goddess of metal, the regressive god of metal, the regressive gods of metal, the regressive god of metal, the regressive goddess of metal, the regressive goddesses of metal, the regressive goddess of metal, the ordinary god of metal, the ordinary gods of metal, the ordinary god of metal, the ordinary goddess of metal, the ordinary goddesses of metal, the ordinary goddess of metal, the extraordinary god of metal, the extraordinary gods of metal, the extraordinary god of metal, the extraordinary goddess of metal, the extraordinary goddesses of metal, the extraordinary goddess of metal, the static god of metal, the static gods of metal, the static god of metal, the static goddess of metal, the static goddesses of metal, the static goddess of metal, the dynamic god of metal, the dynamic gods of metal, the dynamic god of metal, the dynamic goddess of metal, the dynamic goddesses of metal, the dynamic goddess of metal, the land god of metal, the land gods of metal, the land god of metal, the land goddess of metal, the land goddesses of metal, the land goddess of metal, the sea god of metal, the sea gods of metal, the sea god of metal, the sea goddess of metal, the sea goddesses of metal, the sea goddess of metal, the sky god of metal, the sky gods of metal, the sky god of metal, the sky goddess of metal, the sky goddesses of metal, the sky goddess of metal, the god of metal, the gods of metal, the god of metal, the goddess of metal, the goddesses of metal, the goddess of metal, the half god of metal, the half gods of metal, the half god of metal, the half goddess of metal, the half goddesses of metal, the half goddess of metal, the vessel of metal, the vessels of metal, the vessel of metal, the name of metal, the names of metal, the name of metal, the person of metal, the persons of metal, the person of metal, the persona of metal, the personas of metal, the persona of metal, the personage of metal, the personages of metal, the personage of metal, the personality of metal, the personalities of metal, the personality of metal, the personification of metal, the personifications of metal, the personification of metal, the image of metal, the images of metal, the image of metal, the imagination of metal, the imaginations of metal, the imagination of metal, the belief of metal, the beliefs of metal, the belief of metal, the thought of metal, the thoughts of metal, the thought of metal, the word of metal, the words of metal, the word of metal, the action of metal, the actions of metal, the action of metal, the reaction of metal, the reactions of metal, the reaction of metal, the feeling of metal, the feelings of metal, the feeling of metal, the situation of metal, the situations of metal, the situation of metal, the circumstance of metal, the circumstances of metal, the circumstance of metal, the environment of metal, the environments of metal, the environment of metal, the relationship of metal, the relationships of metal, the relationship of metal, the number of metal, the numbers of metal, the number of metal, the formula of metal, the formulas of metal, the formula of metal, the equation of metal, the equations of metal, the equation of metal, the theory of metal, the theories of metal, the theory of metal, the symbol of metal, the symbols of metal, the symbol of metal, the color of metal, the colors of metal, the color of metal, the thing of metal, the things of metal, the thing of metal, the way of metal, the ways of metal, the way of metal, the place of metal, the places of metal, the place of metal, the time of metal, the times of metal, the time of metal, the event of metal, the events of metal, the event of metal, the result of metal, the results of metal, the result of metal, the crown of metal, the crowns of metal, the crown of metal, the throne of metal, the thrones of metal, the throne of metal, the metal king, the metal kings, the metal kingdom, the metal kingdoms, the metal king's subject, the metal king's subjects, the metal king's dominion, the metal king's dominions, the kingdom of metal, the kingdoms of metal, the kingdom of metal, the metal queen, the metal queens, the metal queendom, the metal queendoms, the metal queen's subject, the metal queen's subjects, the metal queen's dominion, the metal queen's dominions, the queendom of metal, the queendoms of metal, the queendom of metal, the metal prince, the metal princes, the metal princedom, the metal princedoms, the metal prince's subject, the metal prince's subjects, the metal prince's dominion, the metal prince's dominions, the princedom of metal, the princedoms of metal, the princedom of metal, the metal princess, the metal princesses, the metal princessdom, the metal princessdoms, the metal princess's subject, the metal princess's subjects, the metal princess's dominion, the metal princess's dominions, the princessdom of metal, the princessdoms of metal, the princessdom of metal, the lord of metal, the lords of metal, the lord of metal, the lordess of metal, the lordesses of metal, the lordess of metal, the priest of metal, the priests of metal, the priest of metal, the priestess of metal, the priestesses of metal, the priestess of metal, the ritual of metal, the rituals of metal, the ritual of metal, the shrine of metal, the shrines of metal, the shrine of metal, the temple of metal, the temples of metal, the temple of metal, the leader of metal, the leaders of metal, the leader of metal, the follower of metal, the followers of metal, the follower of metal, the natural substance of metal, the natural substances of metal, the natural substance of metal, the supernatural substance of metal, the supernatural substances of metal, the supernatural substance of metal, the temporal substance of metal, the temporal substances of metal, the temporal substance of metal, the spiritual substance of metal, the spiritual substances of metal, the spiritual substance of metal, the natural form of metal, the natural forms of metal, the natural form of metal, the supernatural form of metal, the supernatural forms of metal, the supernatural form of metal, the temporal form of metal, the temporal forms of metal, the temporal form of metal, the spiritual form of metal, the spiritual forms of metal, the spiritual form of metal, the age of metal, the ages of metal, the age of metal, the era of metal, the eras of metal, the era of metal, the awakener of metal, the awakeners of metal, the awakener of metal, the awakening of metal, the awakenings of metal, the awakening of metal, the realm of metal, the realms of metal, the realm of metal, the dimension of metal, the dimensions of metal, the dimension of metal, the zone of metal, the zones of metal, the zone of metal, the frequency of metal, the frequencies of metal, the frequency of metal, the century of metal, the centuries of metal, the century of metal, the millennium of metal, the millenniums of metal, the millennium of metal, the purpose of metal, the purposes of metal, the purpose of metal, the meaning of metal, the meanings of metal, the meaning of metal, the culture of metal, the cultures of metal, the culture of metal, the demonstrator of metal, the demonstrators of metal, the demonstrator of metal, the demonstration of metal, the demonstrations of metal, the demonstration of metal, the manifester of metal, the manifestors of metal, the manifester of metal, the manifestation of metal, the manifestations of metal, the manifestation of metal, the presence of metal, the presences of metal, the presence of metal, the glow of metal, the glows of metal, the glow of metal, the goal of metal, the goals of metal, the goal of metal, the plan of metal, the plans of metal, the plan of metal, the book of metal, the books of metal, the book of metal, the philosopher of metal, the philosophers of metal, the philosopher of metal, the philosophy of metal, the philosophies of metal, the philosophy of metal, the releaser of metal, the releasers of metal, the releaser of metal, the release of metal, the releases of metal, the release of metal, the variable of metal, the variables of metal, the variable of metal, the cause of metal, the causes of metal, the cause of metal, the effect of metal, the effects of metal, the effect of metal, the journey of metal, the journeys of metal, the journey of metal, the emergence of metal, the emergences of metal, the emergence of metal, the source of metal, the sources of metal, the source of metal, the originator of metal, the originators of metal, the originator of metal, the origin of metal, the origins of metal, the origin of metal, the forefather of metal, the forefathers of metal, the forefather of metal, the foremother of metal, the foremothers of metal, the foremother of metal, the ancestor of metal, the ancestors of metal, the ancestor of metal, the descendant of metal, the descendants of metal, the descendant of metal, the lineage of metal, the lineages of metal, the lineage of metal, the heritage of metal, the heritages of metal, the heritage of metal, the heir of metal, the heirs of metal, the heir of metal, the co-heir of metal, the co-heirs of metal, the co-heir of metal, the joint heir of metal, the joint heirs of metal, the joint heir of metal, the dynasty of metal, the dynasties of metal, the dynasty of metal, the force of metal, the forces of metal, the force of metal, the law of metal, the laws of metal, the law of metal, the pact of metal, the packs of metal, the pact of metal, the game of metal, the games of metal, the game of metal, the mask of metal, the masks of metal, the mask of metal, the armor of metal, the armors of metal, the armor of metal, the sword of metal, the swords of metal, the sword of metal, the shield of metal, the shields of metal, the shield of metal, the force shield of metal, the force shields of metal, the force shield of metal, the armored force shield of metal, the armored force shields of metal, the armored force shield of metal, the champion of metal, the champions of metal, the champion of metal, the guardian of metal, the guardians of metal, the guardian of metal, the defender of metal, the defenders of metal, the defender of metal, the protector of metal, the protectors of metal, the protector of metal, the chant of metal, the chants of metal, the chant of metal, the shape of metal, the shapes of metal, the shape of metal, the cube of metal, the cubes of metal, the cube of metal, the cuboid of metal, the cuboids of metal, the cuboid of metal, the sphere of metal, the spheres of metal, the sphere of metal, the spheroid of metal, the spheroids of metal, the spheroid of metal, the prism of metal, the prisms of metal, the prism of metal, the pyramid of metal, the pyramids of metal, the pyramid of metal, the cylinder of metal, the cylinders of metal, the cylinder of metal, the cone of metal, the cones of metal, the cone of metal, the triangle of metal, the triangles of metal, the triangle of metal, the circle of metal, the circles of metal, the circle of metal, the semicircle of metal, the semicircles of metal, the semicircle of metal, the square of metal, the squares of metal, the square of metal, the rectangle of metal, the rectangles of metal, the rectangle of metal, the parallelogram of metal, the parallelograms of metal, the parallelogram of metal, the rhombus of metal, the rhombuses of metal, the rhombus of metal, the trapezoid of metal, the trapezoids of metal, the trapezoid of metal, the polygon of metal, the polygons of metal, the polygon of metal, the pentagon of metal, the pentagons of metal, the pentagon of metal, the hexagon of metal, the hexagons of metal, the hexagon of metal, the septagon of metal, the septagons of metal, the septagon of metal, the octagon of metal, the octagons of metal, the octagon of metal, the nonagon of metal, the nonagons of metal, the nonagon of metal, the decagon of metal, the decagons of metal, the decagon of metal, the evolution of metal, the evolutions of metal, the evolution of metal, the revolution of metal, the revolutions of metal, the revolution of metal, the elemental art of metal, the elemental arts of metal, the elemental art of metal, the elemental science of metal, the elemental sciences of metal, the elemental science of metal, the elemental principle of metal, the elemental principles of metal, the elemental principle of metal, the elemental technology of metal, the elemental technologies of metal, the elemental technology of metal, the low elemental art of metal, the low elemental arts of metal, the low elemental art of metal, the low elemental science of metal, the low elemental sciences of metal, the low elemental science of metal, the low elemental principle of metal, the low elemental principles of metal, the low elemental principle of metal, the low elemental technology of metal, the low elemental technologies of metal, the low elemental technology of metal, the high elemental art of metal, the high elemental arts of metal, the high elemental art of metal, the high elemental science of metal, the high elemental sciences of metal, the high elemental science of metal, the high elemental principle of metal, the high elemental principles of metal, the high elemental principle of metal, the high elemental technology of metal, the high elemental technologies of metal, the high elemental technology of metal, the agent of metal, the agents of metal, the agent of metal, the agency of metal, the agencies of metal, the agency of metal, the amplifier of metal, the amplifiers of metal, the amplifier of metal, the amplification of metal, the amplifications of metal, the amplification of metal, the enhancer of metal, the enhancers of metal, the enhancer of metal, the enhancement of metal, the enhancements of metal, the enhancement of metal, the magnifier of metal, the magnifiers of metal, the magnifier of metal, the magnification of metal, the magnifications of metal, the magnification of metal, the influencer of metal, the influencers of metal, the influencer of metal, the influence of metal, the influences of metal, the influence of metal, the emanator of metal, the emanators of metal, the emanator of metal, the emanation of metal, the emanations of metal, the emanation of metal, the converger of metal, the convergers of metal, the converger of metal, the convergence of metal, the convergences of metal, the convergence of metal, the aura of metal, the auras of metal, the aura of metal, the impression of metal, the impressions of metal, the impression of metal, the intelligence of metal, the intelligences of metal, the intelligence of metal, the sophistication of metal, the sophistications of metal, the sophistication of metal, the genius of metal, the geniuses of metal, the genius of metal, the polymath of metal, the polymaths of metal, the polymath of metal, the psychic of metal, the psychics of metal, the psychic of metal, the knowledge of metal, the knowledges of metal, the knowledge of metal, the understanding of metal, the understandings of metal, the understanding of metal, the wisdom of metal, the wisdoms of metal, the wisdom of metal, the secret of metal, the secrets of metal, the secret of metal, the mystery of metal, the mysteries of metal, the mystery of metal, the revelation of metal, the revelations of metal, the revelation of metal, the tactic of metal, the tactics of metal, the tactic of metal, the strategy of metal, the strategies of metal, the strategy of metal, the strength of metal, the strengths of metal, the strength of metal, the might of metal, the mights of metal, the might of metal, the power of metal, the powers of metal, the power of metal, the authority of metal, the authorities of metal, the authority of metal, the dominion of metal, the dominions of metal, the dominion of metal, the rhythm of metal, the rhythms of metal, the rhythm of metal, the melody of metal, the melodies of metal, the melody of metal, the music of metal, the musics of metal, the music of metal, the lyric of metal, the lyrics of metal, the lyric of metal, the song of metal, the songs of metal, the song of metal, the dance of metal, the dances of metal, the dance of metal, the spirit of metal, the spirits of metal, the spirit of metal, the soul of metal, the souls of metal, the soul of metal, the body of metal, the bodies of metal, the body of metal, the mark of metal, the marks of metal, the mark of metal, the promise of metal, the promises of metal, the promise of metal, the visionary of metal, the visionaries of metal, the visionary of metal, the vision of metal, the visions of metal, the vision of metal, the picture of metal, the pictures of metal, the picture of metal, the sound of metal, the sounds of metal, the sound of metal, the dung of metal, the dungs of metal, the dung of metal, the language of metal, the languages of metal, the language of metal, the communication of metal, the communications of metal, the communication of metal, the people of metal, the peoples of metal, the people of metal, the society of metal, the societies of metal, the society of metal, the fortress of metal, the fortresses of metal, the fortress of metal, the government of metal, the governments of metal, the government of metal, the city of metal, the cities of metal, the city of metal, the nation of metal, the nations of metal, the nation of metal, the civilization of metal, the civilizations of metal, the civilization of metal, the world of metal, the worlds of metal, the world of metal,